If you've been driving around the UK lately and parking your car without giving it much thought, you need to pay very close attention to what's happening right now because things are changing in a big way. The government has just announced some major parking law updates that are coming into force throughout 2026. And if you don't understand these new rules, you could end up paying some really hefty fines that could have been easily avoided. This isn't just another small adjustment to parking regulations that you can ignore. This is a complete shakeup of how parking works across England. And it's going to affect every single driver, whether you're driving to work every day, dropping your kids off at school, popping to the shops, or just parking outside your own home. So let me break down everything you need to know in the simplest way possible so you can protect yourself and your wallet. For years and years, one of the biggest complaints that people in the UK have had is about cars parking on pavements. You know what I'm talking about. You're walking down the street pushing a pram with your baby, or maybe you're in a wheelchair, or perhaps you're elderly and using a walking frame, and suddenly you come across a car that's parked halfway or completely on the pavement. What do? You have no choice but to step into the road, into traffic, just to get around the vehicle. It's dangerous, it's frustrating, and it's been happening for decades. Parents have been forced to push their children's buggies into busy roads with cars whizzing past. People who are blind or partially sighted have had to navigate around these obstacles, often ending up in harm's way. In fact, campaigners have pointed out that a staggering 96% of blind and partially sighted people have been forced into the road because of parked cars blocking the pavement. Think about that number for a moment. Nearly every single person with a visual impairment has faced this danger. The government finally decided enough is enough. After years of consultations, debates, and campaigns from groups like Living Streets and Guide Dogs UK, the Department for Transport made an announcement in January 2026 that's going to change everything. The Transport Minister Lillian Greenwood confirmed that local councils across England are now being given brand new powers to crack down on pavement parking. Now, here's the thing that you really need to understand, because this is where it gets interesting and also a bit complicated. The government didn't introduce a complete national ban on pavement parking like they have in Scotland or like they already have in London. Instead, they've decided to give the power to your local council to decide what's best for your area. This is what they're calling a devolved approach, which basically means that the rules might be different depending on where you live in England. Let me explain why this matters so much to you as a driver. In the past, if you wanted to park on the pavement and there were no yellow lines painted there, you could generally get away with it unless it was causing a serious obstruction, or you were driving a really heavy commercial vehicle over 7.5 tons. The police could technically do something about it, but let's be honest, they had bigger fish to fry, and pavement parking was rarely enforced unless someone made a specific complaint. The old system required councils to go through this incredibly lengthy and complex legal process called a traffic regulation order just to ban parking on individual streets. It was so time-consuming and expensive that most councils simply didn't bother. So pavement parking became this accepted thing that everyone did, even though it was causing massive problems for vulnerable people trying to use the pavements. But now, everything is changing. From late 2026 onwards, your local council will have the power to fine you for what they call unnecessary obstruction of the pavement. And here's the kicker: they don't need to put up any new signs or go through those complicated legal processes anymore. The new legislation gives them streamlined powers to enforce restrictions across wider areas of their jurisdiction. This means that a street where you've been parking the same way for 10 or 20 years could suddenly become a place where you get fined, even if nothing has visibly changed and there are no new signs telling you not to park there. So what kind of fines are we talking about here? Well, the expected penalty charge notice levels for 2026 are quite significant. For a standard pavement parking offense, you're looking at £70, although if you pay within 14 days, that drops down to £35. But if your parking is considered a serious obstruction, especially in London and other high-tier enforcement zones, that fine jumps up to £130. Now you might think, well, I'll just pay the lower amount within 2 weeks, but that's still £35 every single time you park in the wrong place. If you're doing that regularly, maybe parking outside your house every day in a way that's now considered an obstruction, those fines are going to add up incredibly quickly. You could be looking at hundreds or even thousands of pounds over the course of a year. Now I know what you're thinking. Where on earth are we supposed to park if we can't use the pavement? This is a genuine concern, and it's the elephant in the room that the government has acknowledged. Millions of homes across the UK, especially those beautiful old Victorian terrace houses, don't have driveways. The streets they're on are narrow, really narrow, and if everyone parks completely on the road without using any of the pavement at all, fire engines and ambulances won't be able to get through. It would cause absolute chaos. The government knows this, and that's why they've built in some flexibility to the new rules, but you need to understand exactly how this flexibility works, because it's not a free pass to park however you like. The guidance that councils are being given says they should use common sense enforcement. What does that mean in practice? Well, delivery drivers are expected to get an exemption for loading and unloading, as long as they don't take more than 20 minutes and they're not causing a dangerous obstruction. So if you see a delivery van parked on the pavement dropping off parcels, that should be okay under the new rules. Councils are also likely to mark out designated permitted pavement parking bays in areas where the road is simply too narrow for any other option. These will be clearly marked with road markings and signs showing you exactly where you can park. The key word here is clearly marked. If it's not marked, you're taking a risk. But here's where it gets tricky and where you really need to pay attention. The rules are going to be different from one council area to another. What's allowed in your town might get you fined in the next town over. You could drive just a few streets away, cross from one council's jurisdiction into another, and suddenly find yourself subject to completely different parking rules. This lack of consistency is something that's worried a lot of people, including motoring organizations like the RAC. Their senior policy officer, Rod Dennis, has pointed out that while most drivers agree that pedestrians shouldn't have to walk in the road because of inconsiderate parking, there are concerns about how fairly and consistently these new powers will be applied across different areas. So, how do you protect yourself from getting caught out by these new rules? The most important thing you can do is check with your local council. I know it sounds boring and like extra hassle, but trust me, it's worth it. Visit your council's website or give their transport or parking department a call to find out exactly what restrictions they're planning to put in place and when those restrictions will start being enforced. Different councils are going to roll out their enforcement at different times throughout 2026, so what might be fine in February could land you with a penalty by September. Don't assume that just because your neighbor has been parking the same way for years that it's going to continue to be okay. And definitely don't assume that what's allowed where you live is going to be allowed when you visit friends or family in another area. When you're out and about, look very carefully for any new road markings or signs. Councils are supposed to provide clear signage showing where pavement parking is and isn't allowed, but in the initial rollout period, there might be some confusion. If you're unsure about whether you can park somewhere, the safest option is to park completely on the road if the road is wide enough, or find a proper car park or designated parking space. Yes, it might be less convenient, but it's a lot less expensive than getting hit with multiple 70-pound fines. Another really important change that's happening alongside the pavement parking updates involves private car parks, and this affects millions of drivers across the UK who use shopping center car parks, hospital car parks, gym car parks, and all those other privately operated parking facilities. The British Parking Association and the international parking community have introduced a new single code of practice that's been rolling out throughout 2024 and into 2026. Existing parking sites have until the end of 2026 to become completely compliant with these new rules, so you're going to see changes happening at the car parks you use regularly. One of the best changes in this new code is something that should make a lot of drivers very happy. There's now a mandatory 10-minute grace period for motorists. What this means is that after your paid parking time ends, you've got 10 extra minutes to get back to your car and leave the car park without being fined. In the past, some private parking companies were absolutely ruthless. The second your time was up, if their cameras caught your car still there, you'd get a penalty charge notice in the post. People were getting fined even though they were literally walking back to their car. This new grace period should put an end to that particular money-grabbing practice. There's also been a change that came into effect very recently in February 2025 that protects drivers from what was called the 5-minute payment rule. This was a particularly nasty practice where, if you didn't complete your payment within 5 minutes of arriving at a camera-monitored car park, you could be hit with a charge. There was actually a case where a driver was charged nearly £2,000 for taking longer than 5 minutes to pay. Can you imagine? £2,000 just because the payment machine was being slow, or you were fumbling for your bank card, or the app wasn't working properly. Under the new rules, as long as you pay in full for your entire stay before you leave the car park, you won't get penalized for how long it took you to make that initial payment. This is a huge improvement and should prevent a lot of unfair charges. The new private parking code also requires standardized signage across all private car parks. The signs need to be clear and easy to understand, showing you exactly where you can and can't park, what the charges are, and what the rules of that particular car park are. No more tiny writing that you need a magnifying glass to read. No more confusing layouts where you're not sure if you're in a legal space or not. And there's a new appeals charter that gives you clearer guidelines for when and how you can challenge a parking charge if you think it's unfair. The maximum parking charge on private land remains capped at £100, or £60 if you pay within 14 days, which is at least some protection against the extortionate fees that some operators were trying to charge. But, and this is important, not everyone is happy with these changes to private parking. The AA has been quite critical, saying that the new code doesn't go far enough. Their head of roads policy, Jack Cousins, pointed out that this code was written by the parking industry itself, not by the government, and it doesn't include some desperately needed measures like capping the charges even further or removing debt recovery fees that add massive amounts on top of the original parking charge. The RAC has also expressed concerns, with their head of policy, Simon Williams, suggesting that this is just an attempt by the private parking industry to look fair while not really changing the practices that harm drivers. The truly effective government-backed code of practice that was promised has been delayed multiple times and still hasn't been fully implemented, which is frustrating for consumer groups who have been fighting for better protections. So what should you do when you're using private car parks? First, always read the signs carefully when you arrive, even if you've used that car park 100 times before. The rules might have changed. Make sure you understand exactly how long you can park, how much it costs, and how you need to pay. Keep your payment receipt or take a screenshot if you're paying by app, because this is your evidence if you need to appeal a charge later. If you're running late and you can see that your parking time is about to run out, try to get back to your car if you possibly can, or if the car park has an option to extend your parking remotely through an app, do that before your time expires. And remember, you now have that 10-minute grace period, so if you're just a few minutes over, you should be protected. If you do receive a parking charge notice that you think is unfair, don't just ignore it, because that will lead to escalating fees and potentially debt collectors getting involved. Look at the notice carefully and check if the parking operator is a member of either the British Parking Association or the International Parking Community, because if they are, they should be following the new code of practice. You have the right to appeal, and there are independent appeal services called POPLA and IAS that will look at your case without you having to go to court. Make sure you appeal within the time limit stated on the notice, usually 14 or 28 days, and provide any evidence you have, like photographs of confusing signage, proof that payment machines weren't working, or evidence that you did actually pay for your parking. Going back to the pavement parking issue, one thing you might be wondering is how the council will actually catch you if you park on the pavement. In the past, someone would have to see you and report you to the police, and the police would have to decide it was worth their time to do something about it. Now councils will have their own civil enforcement officers, the people you might know as traffic wardens, who will be specifically authorized to issue penalty charge notices for pavement parking. These officers will be out in uniform patrolling the streets, and they can issue a fine on the spot if they see your vehicle causing an unnecessary obstruction. Some councils might also use camera technology in the future, although this is more controversial and hasn't been confirmed everywhere yet. The really important thing to understand is what counts as an unnecessary obstruction. This is going to be where a lot of the disputes and confusion arise. An obstruction is generally considered unnecessary if there's enough room for pedestrians to pass safely on the pavement without having to step into the road. If you're parking in such a way that a person in a wheelchair, someone with a pushchair, or a person with a visual impairment using a cane would have to go into the road to get around your car, that's an unnecessary obstruction and you can be fined for it. The government guidance suggests that there should be a clear passageway of at least 1.5 meters, which is about 5 feet, for wheelchairs and pushchairs to get through comfortably. But what if you're on one of those really narrow streets where there's genuinely no other option? This is where your council's local knowledge and discretion comes in. They're supposed to assess each area individually and either provide marked parking bays that allow some pavement parking where it's genuinely necessary, or they might exempt certain streets from enforcement if there's literally no alternative. However, you can't just assume your street will be exempted. You need to check with your council and look for any official markings or notices. For people who have been campaigning for these changes, particularly disabled people and parents with young children, this is a huge victory that's been decades in the making. One parent described how walking her children to school through streets where vans park with all 4 wheels on the pavement, leaving just 6 inches of space, forces her to push the buggy into traffic moving at 30 miles per hour. She said if the new obstruction rules actually get wardens onto their street, it will change their lives. Stories like this show exactly why these changes are happening. It's not about the government trying to squeeze more money out of drivers. It's about making the streets safe and accessible for everyone, especially the most vulnerable people in our society. Of course, there are concerns, particularly from councils themselves. Many local authorities are pointing out that while these new powers are welcome, they need proper resources to implement and enforce them effectively. Council budgets are already stretched incredibly thin, and hiring more enforcement officers, setting up new systems for issuing and managing penalty notices, and dealing with appeals all costs money. There's a worry that some councils won't have the resources to enforce the rules properly, which could lead to an inconsistent patchwork of enforcement across the country. Some areas might be very strict, while others barely enforce the rules at all, which isn't really fair to anyone. There's also the question of what happens if you receive a pavement parking fine that you think is unfair. You'll have the right to appeal to your council first, presenting your case and any evidence you have. If your council rejects your appeal, you can then take it to an independent tribunal. It's really important that you don't just ignore the penalty notice, because if you do, the charge can increase significantly and you could eventually end up in court. But at the same time, don't feel pressured into paying immediately if you genuinely believe the charge is wrong. You have rights, and the appeals process exists for a reason. So, to sum up everything you need to know and remember, parking rules across the UK are changing significantly throughout 2026, and these changes are going to affect your daily life, whether you realize it yet or not. Local councils in England now have new powers to fine drivers for parking on pavements in a way that causes unnecessary obstructions, with fines ranging from £35 to £130, depending on where you are and how quickly you pay. These rules are being rolled out at different times across different council areas, so you need to check what's happening in your specific location and anywhere else you regularly drive. London already has a complete ban on pavement parking, so if you're driving in the capital, keep your car entirely on the road or in proper parking bays. In private car parks, the new code of practice brings in a 10-minute grace period after your parking expires, better protection against unfair payment time limits, clearer signage, and proper appeals processes, with all existing car parks needing to comply by the end of 2026. Always read parking signs carefully, keep proof of payment, and don't be afraid to appeal if you receive an unfair charge. The maximum private parking fine is £100 or £60 if paid within 2 weeks, which is still a lot of money, but at least there's a cap. The best way to avoid getting caught out by these changes is to stay informed. Check your local council's website or contact them directly to understand the specific rules in your area. Look for designated parking bays and clear signage, and when in doubt, park completely on the road if it's safe and legal to do so, or find a proper car park. Don't assume that because you've always parked somewhere in a certain way that you can continue to do so. Things are changing, and ignorance of the new rules won't be an acceptable excuse when you get that penalty notice through your door. By taking just a little bit of time to understand these changes and adjust your parking habits accordingly, you can save yourself from paying out hundreds or even thousands of pounds in unnecessary fines over the coming years. The rules are there to make our streets safer and more accessible for everyone. And while it might take some getting used to, ultimately, that's a goal we can all get behind.